Right. My name is Sasha, Lilley. I produce a program of radical ideas called Against the Grain, and it's my pleasure to be able to moderate this final panel of the conference titled Improvocations with Silvia Federici, Peter Linebaugh, and Ian Ball. And as the title suggests, rather than wrapping up the conference tidily, this session will provoke, perhaps tear apart a little bit, perhaps put together. We'll see. Reframe a number of the questions that have been raised over these 2 days. Let me say something about the structure of the next 2 hours, and I do hope people can bear with us for 2 hours since we are starting, of course, late. Instead of following the kind of format that's been mainly used so far during this conference, we're going to do it a little differently. Silvia, Peter, and Ian will make individual interventions, and then there's going to be a conversation between the three of them, attempt at some sort of dialectic, and then we will open the floor to discussion. So that's the format. Let me just touch on a few of the themes that have come up during these 2 days. Obviously, there have been many that our panelists will perhaps, or perhaps not, explore. One of them is the relationship between the anarchist and Marxist traditions, beyond the split in the First International between the followers of Marx and Bakunin. As the organizers of this conference and many of the panelists have reminded us, there has in fact been a long history of collaboration and fruitful exchanges between the two traditions, not just a history which has also had a very nasty aspect as well. Today, one could make the argument that, at least in the United States, these two traditions, anarchism and Marxism, perhaps are as close together as they've been for a very long time, since perhaps the time of the Wobblies, with the resurgence of libertarian or anti-statist Marxism. At the same time, of course, both Marxism, contemporary Marxism, and contemporary anarchism remain intensely sectarian as well, within themselves, towards each other. But that affinity, that kind of closer affinity between anarchists and Marxists, breaks apart in other places, of course. In Greece, one can see, just judging from the street fights, that anarchists and Marxists don't see themselves as one, I think it would be fair to say. So one of the themes then is anarchism and Marxism after Kronstadt, and perhaps even anarchism and Marxism before Kronstadt, one of the themes. Another theme is that of the relationship between anarchism and feminism. Let's not forget that the area where this gathering takes place was the site of the anarchist, pacifist, feminist occupation, if you will, the Women's Peace Encampment at the Seneca Nuclear Weapons Depot, an extended occupation inspired by Green and Common that took place. And today, anarchism, rightly or wrongly, has come to be associated with a certain kind of consensus politics, which one can in fact trace back to feminism and to the Quakers. So speaking more broadly, what's the role of the social reproduction of labor in an anarchist conception of capitalism and beyond, and how might that inform an anarchist practice? These are some of the questions that I believe Silvia will tackle. A third theme is that of how do we battle, while battling for a different future, how do we preserve and remember the struggles of the past, especially in a time when so many institutions that had been, perhaps to some degree, and a mixed degree, safe havens for the preservation of radical history, including universities to some respect, but also other organizations, when so many of them are just shutting down or shutting that aspect of themselves and tossing in many cases, very literally, archives out into the dumpsters. So how do we preserve that radical history, that complex radical history, those histories of sort of intertwined struggles, at a time when they really are endangered? And how do we use those histories to further our own struggles? So some of the themes: preservation, class struggle, feminism, communism, anarchism, and commonism. These are some of the starting points for our wide-ranging discussion this afternoon, and we're going to start with Silvia Federici. Silvia is a feminist activist, writer, teacher. In 1972, she was one of the co-founders of the International Feminist Collective, the organization that launched the international campaign for wages for housework. Among her writings are Revolution at Point Zero, published by Piano Press, and Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation.
Working? Okay.
I can take it off.
And I can actually speak? I feel much more comfortable actually doing it this way than behind this podium. I have 15 minutes, so these days in particular, I find it very difficult to sum up things in a very short time. As I grow, I'm becoming more long-winded. So it's not going to be easy for me to actually make a profound statement in such a short time. But starting from the title of this section, which is the provocation, I want to bring some presences to this conference that I think are going to be important for us when we go, and we use what we've learned here in our struggle. And the first presence that I want to bring is the presence of women in the anarchist movement. I think that that presence has been somewhat underplayed in the conference, even though many speakers, of course, make reference to it and underline how important women have been in that movement. And I want to do that not only because, of course, women were very prominent. Think of Emma Goldman, think of organizations like Mujeres Libres during the Spanish Civil War, and many others also today. For example, there are anarchist, feminist, anarchist organizations like Mujeres Creando in Bolivia, which is extremely important. But also because with feminism in the anarchist movement comes a whole range of issues that we have not discussed and we need to discuss. Issues such as the critique not only of the state, but the critique of the family, the critique of marriage, and above all the critique of men's authority, both within political organization and also within the family structure. In fact, it's because of this critique that the anarchist movement had such an important influence on the women's movement. I would say, in my experience, the first phase of the women's movement, that phase that was far more radical, the radical utopian phase, before the division that came with the delineation of strategies, in that phase anarchism was probably the most important influence. And it was precisely because of this anti-authoritarian critique, and because women found that criticizing and fighting against the male authority was in fact a condition, a precondition for participation in any other struggle. Today, it's extremely important to raise the question of women in the movement, because we need to think of the question of reproduction as a central political issue in our movement, because it is starting from the transformation of everyday life, the transformation of the reproduction work, that in fact we can begin to change society. And in fact, feminism is extremely very important, and I'm not going to go, I don't have the time, and I really don't want to engage into that. I mean, I'm not going to make any justification for the fact that I still use the word feminist, and I still use the concept of women. I know that now for a number of years there's been a whole postmodern current that has denied the validity of the category of women as a political and analytic category. I'm not going to go into that. I will simply state that, and maybe in the discussion we can see why, it's still a fundamental category, because, among other things, most of the issues that the feminist movement and the anarchist movement fought against are still there with us. For the feminist movement, certainly the whole issue of the devaluation of reproductive work is still fundamental. The whole issue of the division that exists within the proletariat, the market, you call it whatever you want, within the working class, are still there. For example, the question of violence. We have a very, very important question of violence of men against women. And if we want to build a society built on cooperation, built on commons, we cannot afford to have that. We cannot have a society of commons, for instance, where half of the commons are beating up the other half. Therefore, this is new. I have to say on this point that there are now many initiatives, starting not only from women, but also starting from men in New York and on the West Coast, for example, that begin to approach the question of male violence against women, against children, against male partners as well. And they're beginning to approach in a way that I think is extremely important, and I think will be very congenial to the logic and to the objective of the anarchist movement, because they're beginning to look at it in a way that tries to skirt, to go beyond the resorting to the police in order to deal with the problem. So there are now many collectives, for example, Anti-Male Supremacy Collective in New York, who are doing work to basically recuperate, return to the community men who have been abusers, rather than instead turning to the police as the last resort. There's much more to say. I don't have the time to do that, but there's something else I really want to talk about. How much do we time? Okay, good. And I want to speak about the other absence that I felt somewhat during the conference, and that is the absence of the Occupy movement, which I believe is a movement that is extremely important. It's been the most important movement in many years in the United States, in Canada, across the world. And I want to say, first of all, something about the word occupy, because I understand what Glenn said, where Glenn is coming from. And I know the word occupy is a word that is somewhat disturbing. But at the same time, I would vouch that the Occupy movement used the word occupy probably in the same way in which Marx used the word expropriate. When Marx spoke about it's time to expropriate the expropriator, he did not refer to expropriation by the working class of the capitalist in terms of acquiring new property. He spoke in terms of actually putting an end to property. And I think that the Occupy movement used that term in the same spirit, not in the spirit of an acquisition of property. But however, at the same time, I think it's extremely important for the Occupy movement and for any anti-totalitarian, anti-capitalist, and egalitarian movement in the making to come to pose the question of the overcoming immediately in our political practice of the ways in which we have been divided. And I think I'm very, very grateful to the organizers of the conference that they have insisted on the polygenesis of the anarchist movement and have been critical of the diffusionist point of view. I think if we want to really pursue that path, we also have to rethink and understand much better those indigenous traditions that in fact have made the difference, have made in fact for the possibility of anti-authoritarian movement, anti-capitalist movement coming from different parts of the world at the same time. And I think that the thinking of those traditions is also important. It's part of the process of going to the past that actually projects us into a different future. I want to say also that the Occupy movement, in my view, is one movement that has begun to bridge that divide between Marxism and anarchism. Because, yes, Because, in fact, no, not true? Okay, good, we have a discussion now, fantastic. I think it's beginning because I think that the very fact that the many in the Occupy movement are young people who are not encrusted into all doctrinaire divisions and the speculations has helped into the process, so is a movement that tends to be also more practical and has been in the best, at its best, able to take from different forms. Whatever the state of the Occupy movement, I think that this is what we need now. We need a kind of movement that takes from the anarchist movement, that takes from the Marxist movement, takes the critique of Marx, the critique of exploitation, which I think is still fundamental, takes from the anarchist movement also the anti-authoritarian critique, takes from the feminist movement, and takes from the movement, and the indigenous movement, and the movement from Black Power, the anti-colonial movement. None of this movement is self-subsistent. If there's something I really want to bring to this conference, to say that none of this movement is self-subsistent, is complete. None of this movement, that we need to bring a movement that is actually able to use different parts, different aspects of the movement that has been created, obviously within a common anti-capitalist horizon. This at least is my perspective. But certainly we cannot, in a sense, think of producing a new society unless we first address the different ways in which workers, proletarians have been divided. This is to me the first, most fundamental task that exists now. If we go beyond the division along race, gender, coloniality, nationality, we cannot build a movement. And to me, this is the essence of what I think is the perspective of the common. This is what a common is to do. Thank you.
So there's more room for discussion then, I guess. All right, so our next speaker is Peter Linebaugh.
Maybe I want to say something. Actually, I brought this, and I wanted to add something about the Occupy movement. The one good result of the Occupy movement is being that it has brought already has had a unifying impact. And one unifying impact has been in its tackling of the issue of debt. And for example, in New York, we now see that starting, first of all, the Occupy movement gave a big impulse to the movement of students against debt. And as in the second phase of the movement, we now have a movement that is broader than students themselves, and is beginning to bring together students fighting against the debt, the debt because of the loan. Also, people have debts around mortgages, credit cards, and it's beginning to create a coalition. And one of the last products of this movement has been the debtor's manual. So if you have a debt, and of course this is an abomination because knowledge should be a common, knowledge should not be negotiable, should not be a commodity, knowledge production should be something that you don't have to pay for. But in any case, you should know that this is everything you wanted to know about how to fight against student debt and the commercialization of knowledge. Is now a nice, very good book that you can access. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Peter Linebaugh. He's professor of history at the University of Toledo. He's the author of many acclaimed works, including The London Hanged, Albion's Fatal Tree, with E.B. Thompson and others, the Magna Carta Manifesto, and the Many-Headed Hydra with Marcus Rediger. His most recent works include Ned Ludd and Queen Mab, and an introduction to the republication of E.B. Thompson's William Morris, Romantic to Revolutionary. Peter Linebaugh.
Okay. I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Barry, and thank you for the organizers for making it possible, bringing us together. It takes me a while to get going. It's so great to see friends from different parts of my life here, from Rochester, New York, from Bristol in England. You know, it's really great, and it's wonderful to meet new comrades and new friends. Yeah, I've been listening like for 2 days. It's really been very intense, and like Silvia, I'm kind of tired out. But I know my duty is to offer some things from history. I could not listen to any talk without active mind, you know, and wanting to add to what they say, and it's really been exciting for me to be here. I'm glad I came. Okay. Yeah, and I was reading David Graeber before I came. He makes a number of mistakes. I wish he was here because he really relates to like mistakes and being correct. But I learned actually, you know, I mean, he's really smart. He likes to let you know about it. And when I'm around him, you know, near him, I always start talking slower and pretend I'm a cowboy or something, you know. Develop a drawl just to see what he'll do. And isn't he part of Occupy? Doesn't he sort of like one of the, you know, so it's okay to criticize him even though he's not here. But what I was going to say had to do with consensus, you know, and I come from an older tradition where you just argue one another, you know, until you go to your bedroom. But he said that in the consensus building, you don't think about what separates you from other people. You don't try to persuade people who you disagree with, because you disagree with everyone. But you try to work with them to some common goal. Is that the methodology? Okay. So with that in mind, okay, I'll try to say something. No, really, it's trying to change. When we came here yesterday, there was a sign up on the, that used to be on the highway. It used to be back in the 20s and 30s when you drove on the highway, you would stop and read the signs. You know, the idea wasn't just to go fast, but it was to, you know, travel and learn about the landscape. And this sign said, we're here in Cayuga country. And the sign spoke about Sullivan's raid and the village that was nearby. And this is a big part of what they call the American Revolution back in the 1770s. And here's the main point, but I'm glad I raised that. The main point that I'd like to make is I studied a time before the isms, so before anarchism, before socialism, before, what else is there, communism. So it's the 18th century, you know, and also I have different ideas about what you all call the Enlightenment. And like, see, David Graeber in his book, he was saying, I have the quotation here, he was saying there were two revolutions, the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, and they had nothing in common with each other. And I really disagree with that. And I wish he was here. So tell him I'm out looking for him. And I hope to meet up. You know, we'll deal with this. Because I think both those things, the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, they had to do with each other. And they were both against us. They were both against the commons all around the world. In Cayuga country, in Iroquois, in Ireland, in Scotland, in England, in Mexico, in France. It's not called the bourgeois revolution for nothing. The bourgeois revolution is a capitalist revolution, my friends. And we got to remember that. And both those things, both the technological mechanical regime and the republic regime of the French bourgeoisie, the liberal state, is against the living commons. These were efforts to inaugurate capitalism and private property. When Ian had the tweezer, the swizzle stick up, he was trying to, or what I got from that, was this ruling class is puny. They're Lilliputian. They do not deserve their wealth or their power. They are criminals. And they have a long history. And we can bring them down. This was, I shouldn't shout, should I? But from the comrades who have taught us about the anarchist brothers and revolutionaries from the past, beautiful, thank you. I am capable of learning. But I have a few more minutes, right? Okay, Sullivan, he came through this area, he burnt the towns, he destroyed the orchards, he uprooted the corn, he destroyed the women and children, he raped, he burnt, he murdered. This was part of the American War of Independence, the Sullivan's raid through Iroquois country here. These were scenes of Auschwitz. These were scenes of destruction, deliberate murder. And among the letters preserved is a young officer who is writing to his fiancée of the great loneliness which is creeping into my soul with every hour and every mile which separates me from you. He wrote to her days before he was killed. I feel really guilty, he wrote her, as I applied the torch to huts that were homes of content until we ravagers came spreading desolation everywhere. You see, they know what they're doing. Our mission here is ostensibly to destroy, but may it not transpire that we pillagers are carelessly sowing the seeds of empire. He wrote. Monday, the 17th of September, just a few days ago, the New York Times carried the story of the 8 women who were destroyed at nighttime in eastern Afghanistan by bombs from the U.S., from the USA. They were out collecting firewood to make the breakfast fire before their working day began. That was on Monday. This is the destruction which is wrought by this class which claims, which is imperializing, claiming our lives, and will stop at nothing. It's the same story in the New York Times had this Karzai saying the Americans have 3,000 prisoners in their jail, and the Americans refused to give the jail to the Karzai because Karzai refuses to sign a guarantee that he won't give the 3,000 prisoners a trial. So the Afghan president is standing for trial by jury, do you see? The women of Afghanistan, at nighttime, go out looking for sticks to make a fire. And the U.S. bombs them. 5 minutes. Okay, I'm just saying that because all that's in the Magna Carta, you know, which I got stuck on a few years ago. The Magna Carta, huh? Who would have thought that we'd be talking, that I'd be talking about the Magna Carta now? Because it's for trial by jury. It's for estovers for women. Estovers, that means a common right, a customary right. Usos y costumbres. So I wanted to put that, you know, to us here. Okay, so I've got 2 minutes, let's say, and I want to be like, but I did want to say one more thing. I was really excited to learn about Jeff, to learn about the story from Argentina, because here was communism. Okay, I'll use an ISM. The Commons, that was a center of a European debate, you know, in the middle of the Enlightenment, with Montesquieu, Voltaire, Diderot chiming in against the Jesuits. But not Voltaire. Voltaire, he was winking at it. But there were 30 towns, more than 100,000 people, indigenous people, living up the river, across from what would become Buenos Aires, without private property, without slavery, for more than a century, until the 1760s. And I was thrilled, Ian. I was thrilled to learn that William Blake, in the middle of the 1790s, he was just a Londoner. He never left London. Well, he did once. He got scared and went to the coast, but then he came back. But he was just a total stay-at-home, sedentary anarchist, you might say. But let's not say might say, he was an antinomian. And he was a revolutionary. But he said, and there are 30 cities divided. These are the 30 cities of the indigenous commons in South America of the 1760s, and the 30 cities divided in form of a human heart. No more could they rise at will in the infinite void, but bound down to earth by their narrowing perceptions, they lived a period of years, then left a noisome body to the jaws of devouring darkness. And their children wept and built tombs in the desolate places and formed laws of prudence and called them the eternal laws of God. And the 30 cities remain surrounded by salt floods, now called Africa. Blake, in 1734, these are the years of the birth of anarchism and communism. You know William Godwin for the anarchists. You know Gracchus Babeuf for the communists. If we have studied our isms and where they come from, just to make some other names. But this was from a revolutionary time when the capitalist powers, the powers of France and England, united in their mutual violence and mutual destruction to destroy the commons in those countries and elsewhere as part of their imperializing. And Blake, this antinomian visionary revolutionary, he is learning from the First Nations. This is the what I wish to propound is that we have. I was going to say we have been a unity. We can find a unity, brothers and sisters, brown and white, proletariat libertarians of the world unite, type of thing. I've got some more minutes. I hand it over to my comrade.
Our final speaker is Linebaugh. He's an Irish social historian of science, techniques, and the commons. He's associated with Retort Collective and one of the co-authors of Retort's Afflicted Powers, Capital and Spectacle in a New Age of War. He's also co-editor of West of Eden, Communes and Utopia in Northern California. He's affiliated with the Institute of Humanities at Birkbeck, University of London, and co-director of Mayday Rooms, a safe haven for archives from below. Linebaugh.
Thank you, Sasha. Could I ask someone at the back just to go to Ramsey and ask him to bring a copy of Nedlud and West of Eden? I meant to do that. Thank you. Well, once again, yeah, it's very moving. We were here in 2007. We're back again, we're rested, we're ready. Yes, thank you to Barry. Sorry, let me reverse this. To Shelley and Barry Wong for their hospitality. Once again, to Sasha Lilley. Many of you know Sasha, Jim Fleming, Autonomy Media. Now West of Eden, it only remains. Copy of West of Eden, is that possible? So Sasha, extraordinary work as a producer of Against the Grain. Who here listens to Against the Grain? Yeah, I commend it to the rest of you because it's streamed. It's the beacon in the wasteland of Pacifica. I feel very strongly about what's happened in Pacifica. And it was through, actually, Barry and Shelley that I came to know, it's George Kofensis. Thank you, George. Shout out. That I came to know Eleanor McKinney, one of the Troika who founded Pacifica. Eleanor, Richard Moore, and Lewis Hill. People think it was just Lewis Hill, but it wasn't. It was the three of them. And Lewis Hill came out of the CO camps of the Second World War. They resisted, not because they refused to kill, but because they thought that it was a war, that it was an inter-imperialist rivalry, which it was, but it was also eventually a war against fascism, of course. They wanted to do what, they knew that their little Gestetnet pamphlets, Ramsey is still, like myself, a partisan of the pamphlets, the first of the Retort series of pamphlets. We'll come back to that. They didn't do the job, they didn't stop the global conflict. And so Lou Hill, who had a beautiful radio voice, those of you who've heard it, there's a few hours of Lou's voice that have been preserved. He was the renegade son of an oil family from the south. And he went to Stanford. He was a Kierkegaardian. He was a capitalist, but he had some money, but he was a pacifist, and so Pacifica. Right? But he understood that the radicality was in the form as much as the content. He knew that he wanted to have mass effects, that Dwight McDonald kind of thing. And so they tried to get a license. They couldn't get an AM license to broadcast radical dialogics to the people of the Bay Area, particularly in Richmond, where the Liberty ships had been built at the Kaiser shipyards. The state would not allow him that. And actually the anarchist mentor said, be careful Eleanor, be careful Lou, be careful Dick. You're going to have to get a license and the state will come back to bite you. Bourgeois form, trustees. And it did. In fact, Dick Moore retreated after 5 years. He went on air in 1949. That tremendous legacy has been traduced in all kinds of ways. What's interesting philosophically, talking to Dick Moore, who's still alive, his poems have just been published by the University of California Press, 92 going on 65. A luminous man. And he didn't like what happened to Pacifica, the form, the beautiful form, the radicality of the form. When people turned on that radio, it wasn't just the candid voice at the microphone. It was the fact that it wasn't a kind of Fordist production line. Nowadays, if you have 10 seconds of dead air at KPFA, they'll sack you probably. I mean, it's the same as, right? Something like that. No, I mean, Sasha's a great pro, and that's good. We don't like dead air, but necessarily. But remember, that was a kind of he was basing the thought here was a kind of Wittgensteinian. It was kind of the dialogue happens, as it were, in the spaces between silence. So it would be in typographic terms, it would be justified left and ragged right. And in those cushions of silence, either that you went off air or you had in your backpack Blake, Cervantes, Milton, Dante, Du Bois, Wollstonecraft. The word peace, of course, at retort our pamphlet during the war was neither their war nor their peace, which was an older slogan. We knew that the peace that we face with now, given Randolph Bourne and the fact that, if the state has an income and a standing army, then it only needs just the acquiescence of its population. War is the health of the state, he said in 1917. It's still true. Long ago, Tacitus said, at the northernmost reaches of the Roman Empire, up on the highlands where the Romans too, rampaged, but the English cleared the Highland Scots. In a kind of similar operation, which is repeated here by the Lakes. And George Defences has written powerfully about the Scottish Enlightenment. And the juxtaposition, the adjacency of the uncivilized Highlanders that was the conversation in his mind that Hume and co were in. And so Tacitus says, desertam fecerent et pacem appellabent. They made a desert and called it peace. I think Peter's right, before the isms, yes, we like that. So, thank you, Sasha, for your work at Pacifica. And we heard Peter in his Old Testament oratorical mode there, but he could keep his powder dry. We arrived, we went into the Flora, the nutritionist, the radical nutritionist, Flora... Flora Rose. Home economics, also travesty. An honourable thing, home economics, right? The social reproduction, it's all here, right? Apparently it's been renamed, but we're keeping the same initials, right? What's it now?
It used to be, someone else speak to this.
Okay, home economics. Flora Rose's home economics has been turned into human ecology, a vast, lowering building that's about to consume the house of the toboggans. No. So we're on the stairs, and the tutor for the young people there is taking us up to meet Silvia, who's come separately to Cornell. And he very graciously says, aha, so you're here for the postmodernist congress. And Peter said, yes, something like that. Yeah. Which brings me to a couple of remarks. I want to say a bit about science, about Kropotkin, because I found myself as a historian of science and techniques, oddly, honorifically, working in a department of geography at Berkeley. An honourable building called the Earth Sciences Building, renamed McCone Hall after the head of the CIA whose name was being laundered. That's how they do it. Enlightenment, truth. Yeah, so we had an interesting sociological account of revolution today, and I think Kuhn was invoked briefly. Am I right? Was that right? The structure of scientific revolutions. Tom Kuhn was the point man selected by James Conant, the chemist, who mediated between the big science, the largest scientific project still, techno-scientific project in human history, namely the building of the weapons of Armageddon, 3 huge secret cities, a massive geography of sacrifice as a result. We were the only power that actually bombed our own native spaces, the empty spaces, of course, in Nevada. The Russians do, of course, in Kazakhstan, the Brits did it in Australia, the French in Oceania. Conant knows that in the American century, it's not good enough just to have a brush with Plato and Aristotle and Machiavelli, that it has to be supplemented by the new science. So he says we need departments of the history of science to tell the young Americans about the trajectory from darkness, superstition and barbarism into the sunlit uplands and into enlightenment and rationality. 5 of these departments are set up. Tom Kuhn is there in Cambridge, Mass, to tell that story. It goes badly wrong. He looks at the Copernican revolution and realizes that there's no rational reason why this new story overtook the old one. It was a bit of a shocker. Kuhn didn't like the implications that our scientific theories are social all the way, as it were, right? That 17th century atomism is really the Lockean individual projected onto nature. It doesn't make it false, any more than it makes it false that Darwin's natural economy is the Victorian political economy projected onto nature. Darwin was a magnificent, a brilliant naturalist, of course. Yeah, fine, good. Darwin was read by Peter Kropotkin, the great geographer, a page boy in the Tsar's court. He goes to the Far East, he elucidates the geology of Asia, and he becomes an anarchist. And anarchism, we've learned this weekend, right, that anarchism and Marxism, these are modern, modern cardboard disputations mostly, right? But Kropotkin wanted to reply to Darwin, and he did. And he did it in a way that it was essentially to say, okay, you just spent too much time in the tropics. Right? If you come to Siberia, there's no superfecundity, right? You've been reading too much Malthus, the world's first economist. So Kropotkin takes Malthus away from Darwin, and I think that story needs to be revisited. Mutual aid, yeah. Kropotkin. It was a different world then, right? If you want to read, still maybe the finest statement of anarchism, it's go to Encyclopedia Britannica. They invited him to write the entry under anarchism. Can you imagine? I think I'll leave the rest of the things I want to say for the dialogics, except to say that a lot of people have come to me today and said, I want to know more about media rooms, about archiving from below. And I'll just say that I'm sorry that I promised in terms of the methodology and the way in which knowledge is, as it were, impure, and that what we need to understand is at the very moment when Enrico Fermi is doing his great experiment, secretly in the basement under the west stand of Stag Field, when the world's first atomic pile goes critical at about 3:30 on the afternoon of December the 2nd, 1942, in Hyde Park. Almost within earshot, I think we can say that the first sounds of free jazz could be heard. It's a kind of story of the road not taken, or at least we need to be aware of these kind of parallel temporalities. Peter's tremendous at upsetting, as I say, the kind of official stadiumism. And in West of Eden, it's quite clear that these kind of pictures of communards in Northern California, that look like that straight out of the 19th century. It's happening at the same time, or 5-6 years after the birth of punk in LA. So Mayday Rooms is open for the salvaging of threatened archives from below, but also we're trying to do something theoretical. Copyright came up. This is maybe could be part of our conversation. There are new enclosures. Silvia and George and the Midnight Notes and some of the Retort crew have been working on the idea of an enclosure as explaining that it wasn't a one-time thing at the dawn of history, as we discussed. The new enclosures include, for example, the digital life, the digital world, right? And I'd like to discuss afterwards, it's a knotty problem for Mayday. Our first colloquium, before we moved into the building, was entitled Neither Private Nor Public. Information in common, question mark. It's a tricky one. It's a really tricky one. And in fact, the clever right-wing lawyer who clerked for Posner, one of the architects of neoliberal ideology, Larry Lessig at Stanford, he understood that if you enclosed the backbone of the internet, that it was going to block, it was going to be a problem for what he called innovation, which is code for profit. And he comes up with Creative Commons. We don't like that because it's still trapped in the logic of the state. In that sense, it's the anti-state. How do you go beyond copyleft? Very deep problem. And we look forward to discussions of that and any help you can give. I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, so I guess this is where our panelists discuss some of these questions with each other. I guess I'll start by provoking, perhaps rather rudely, one line of discussion, which is that, Peter, you mentioned in reflecting on the conference that there were a number of sort of tales and explorations of individual men, women, especially men, but that social forces and class struggles seem to be absent from a lot of the discussion. So I'm going to impertinently put you on the spot with something you said to me privately and ask you about that.
Well, I think I believe, well, I was saying to Glenn that class is not a subjectivity alone. It's not class is not a concept, it's an objective relationship, I believe. And I'm one that, like Raj, I use the term working class. I don't use the term multitude. And I also use the word proletariat. I think these have been helpful to me. But they change. You know, the composition changes in history. And I think one of the great things that this conference is helping us to see is that the composition of the proletariat, or the labor power that capital wishes to make available to itself, is all over the place. And that this is right from the beginning of the imperializing project. In fact, that's what imperializing is about, in addition to plunder and extraction. It's about creating homeless, deracinated, dispossessed, rootless people who become boat people. And one of the ways of doing that is by letters of blood and fire, is by the terror, and then with the Americans, it's from the air. It's with bombing. This is the significance of one of the oldest commons in the world is in the eastern Afghanistan, which neither the Russians, the British, the Greeks were able to suppress. But when Elphinstone rode through there in the first British embassy in 1812, he was struck by the wish, by the redistribution of land, and he had in his pocket Tacitus. And Tacitus, the Roman property imperializer, had been writing about the savages of the north of Europe, the indigenous people of northern Europe. And this was, so do you follow? From one empire to another, they're learning from each other about how to destroy the indigenous people and to include them within the labor power that's then available to them. This is a conversation.
But what I'd like to say is that the question of social movement, as Peter pointed out, is crucial. And I think it came many times through the room, but it was never perhaps thematized. So we heard of many social movements. I think what is the next step is to see how, for example, the different presentation and the stories that were presented will come together, particularly with in mind where we are going. Because speaking the past is extremely crucial, but it is crucial in terms of figuring out, and the situation now is of such extreme urgency. I mean, Peter spoke about the war. He brought the war, and the war is also in the streets of New York, in the streets of the United States, in the streets of the world. I think we're confronting a situation right now, for instance, that as new movements are coming to the foreground, that in fact are rediscovering these communitarian forms of organization, the assemblies, the consensuses, and creating new forms of communism. The type of repression that is also coming into place, it's incredible. Now, in fact, we are confronting a situation where even assembly is forbidden. I mean, you assemble and they arrest you. On September 17, for the anniversary of the occupation in Wall Street, in New York, the most peaceful kind of initiative were met with 180 arrests. And in many cases, the police just took people, arrested people. Maybe they carried a banner. We think that it was also because now they work with the CIA, and so they carry into their pockets the pictures of what now they have collected because of the way in which the arrested people were practically doing nothing except they were assembling in certain places. So I think that the situation that we are confronting is now one that put an urgency on the discourses that we have, the writing that we produce, in terms of seeing how we are going to respond. What are we going to do about these drones that are going to killing people across the world, about the kind of repression that is expressed in so many ways, like when they arrest you now, they don't just arrest you, right? I mean, even the most peaceful demonstrator now is thrown into the ground, they practically dislodge your shoulders. The level of terror that is now being exercised, on people who are engaging in the most peaceful type of protest, it's incredible. And also, what are we going to do against the fact that we are in a society that is a prison, that is the largest prison in the world, and that still has death camps. Now, it still has the death penalty, which is the ultimate abomination, the ultimate, as Peter showed us so powerfully, is the ultimate arm in the class war. And I hope we are going to also hear from you, because our conversation is supposed to stimulate the broader conversation in the room.
Thank you. Just from this prompts thoughts about the politics of space and the creation of new forms of collectivity. Spinoza had an idea of the multitude. The proletariat supposedly was going to be the grave digger on the basis of the incarceration and reduction of what are called factories. And then a Venetian neo-Franciscan Leninist had the idea that the computer would produce a new multitude. That would be the grave digger. I liked it. Yes. Naming no names. I'm interested in the kind of collectivity that happens in the streets, in the open air. History is made in the open air. I've learned this from Peter on our field trips in Ohio, Tom Paine's birthplace, Bedford, the importance of the open air. And I said something about this down at the Buffalo bookstore. And there are a few of you were there, but not many, so I could actually just read a paragraph about what seems to be the puzzle of the extraordinary overreaction. Silvia is completely right, isn't it? Is there an explanation for this? Well, we puzzled over this, those of us who were involved in critical mass. Cycling en masse, political cycling en masse goes back to the 19th century. There were tens of thousands in the streets of San Francisco in 1896 after the Annus Mirabilis with the bicycle. 1895, which unfortunately triggered the genocide in the Congo because of the bottleneck of the recovery of rubber in Amazonia. The Brasilia heaviensis was scattered through, and it caused a capitalist bottleneck. Not that the rubber tappers knew exactly why they were being so immiserated. King Leopold had the idea that there was the window would close. He knew that when they came online in Malaya it was over. But he had some rubber there. There are many thousands of plants that produce latex inferior. The Linebaugh vine does it. And Adam Hochschild has a good account of this, many of you know that. But he doesn't connect it to the invention of the pneumatic sausage on the bicycle by an Irish vet, a Scottish vet, with a big practice in Ireland. This story is told in The Green Machine. But I want to say that the criminalization of cyclists is kind of interesting, because they had to make it up as they went along, right? Organized coincidence of a couple of thousand enraging motorists in their motorized quadricycles. Last month, a massive assault on them. And very much, I'm working with the rickshaw pullers in India, and the clearances of the street is very important. So we must connect the movement in the squares with the movement in the arteries, right? Those two struggles must come together. And listening to the beautiful, very beautiful presentation of Tahrir Square, it was striking that it was the stopping of traffic that was the precondition, I understand, for the deliberations, for the practice of democracy in the open air. And anyone who's been to Cairo and tried to cross that space, I mean, it makes the Arc de Triomphe look like a deserted mall. And I also learned that a few days later, the sound of the trucks arriving, the sound of motorized traffic arriving, was a counter-revolutionary sound. That seems to me to be right. It was interesting to me that they never did stop the traffic past St. Paul's, which is about 300 yards from the Mayday Room's home now. And when I heard a tremendous talk by Massimo De Angelo, some of you might know his work at the Common. He's an Italian farmer who moonlights as a professor of political economy in London by EasyJet. Not so easy. But Massimo gave a magnificent talk. We could hardly hear it because of the passing traffic. You had to be close by. And so to do our deliberations there was extremely hard. And so we have to take this politics of space tremendously seriously. And so what kinds of what kind of language are we using? And so what I say here is that at certain moments, I said, and that was true for West of Eden, when the bulldozers came to bulldoze, the rusticating hippies who just wanted to be left alone. They weren't fighting You know, they went on the streets of Telegraph Avenue, they rusticated to Mendocino, leave us alone. No, they wouldn't, they came with the bulldozers. In times of social crisis, the carapace of the dominant order is unable to contain new forms of life, new social relations. They burst through the received categories and offend the bureaucrat's register of conforming use. Quite typically, they will be misrepresented. Sometimes they elude representation altogether, visual and otherwise. They're likely to be assigned to older, established genre. And I wonder, the anarchist wonders whether proletariat or masses captures it. Anarchists prefer popular. There's a kind of more, it's more cultural, it's more active. Masses seem to have a kind of Newtonian inertia somehow that need vanguards to shove into action. In the same way that a new medium will first be envisaged in terms of an older one, say television as theatre, these are productive metaphors, or car as horseless carriage. Language lags behind, novel idioms have to be coined to reflect these unpredicted eruptions onto the urban scene: sit-in, acid test, guerrilla theatre, critical mass, scratchiti, pop-up, occupy.
There's something about language that I wanted to say about something about language, just because we are in an academic environment. And this brings me back, and I hope it's not too much of a digression about what we did. One of the great contributions that the women's movement, at least in its initial phase, made to an anti-authoritarian struggle was to refuse to criticize the language that had been used in the movement and to fight for the democratization of language. And what I mean by that, at least for a certain period of time, there was an extreme attention to how we would speak and how we would write. And with the idea in mind that there's nothing is more shameful than to make other people ashamed because they don't understand what they hear. And that is so important, which does not mean to simplify things and to speak in a way that treats others as not capable of understanding, but simply means that when you write, you build the steps. You use every steps you can, so you give people the tool to understand what you're talking about. And I don't say this in reference to this conference, but I'm saying in reference to the academic world in which we are, in which we all have to juggle very different things. And I have to say that I've been very disappointed in over the years to see that, for example, what has happened to the language of many feminists. But this was a very, very important element within the women's movement, of which often is not talked about.
So let me throw another question out, and then let's open it up to everyone else. Since I don't know if really the point of this panel is to try and reach some kind of synthesis or not, but one of the things that all three of you have worked on is the question of communism. And I wanted to ask you, in the context of this conference, in the context of thinking about anarchism, thinking about Marxism, what is communism? How does it relate? Does it in some way allow us to get around some of the questions that have been raised during these last 2 days?
Yeah, the question of communism. This is a very long. Yes, I say that it allows to go beyond some of this division, in the sense that communism. I've been a late comer to the notion of the commons. I have to say that even though I've encountered the commons in my work, in my writing, and even though I've encountered the commons also in a more direct way, because I lived in Africa and I've learned about actual existing commons, not necessarily commons that are the ideal forms of organization, because the commons in Africa, as many parts of the world, have gone through many, many phases of colonialism, and so they've changed, they've adapted, and in many cases adopted exclusionary politics as well. At the same time, even though I had this contact, it took me a while, and Peter knows, to be convinced that this was actually a very important politics. But I see now, and I see the issue of the commons not only from the point of view of offering an alternative, offering a role, which is otherwise foreclosed to us, because certainly state communism is not a practicable way, and certainly any kind of, let me put it in a different way. Today the commons are not only an objective for a society of the future, but also they are a very important instrument in terms of creating the material condition, for a movement that can in fact grow, that can in fact begin to confront the divisions that have been planted within the body of the international proletariat. And so I see the commons both as a material condition for the growth of a movement, for the growth of an anti-capitalist movement, and I also see the commons as a perspective that we have to bring to every struggle in which we are engaged. In other words, the commons to me is also something that you bring when you're working around wage issues, when you're struggling around wage issues, or when you're struggling against the dispossession of vendors in the street that Ian was talking about. Because it's first of all the question of creating a common interest, the question of creating a collective subject, which now is still something on the horizon. It's still something that we don't have. In fact, as I said before in my first presentation, it seems to me that this is the center of the political work that we need to do. So this is what...
Yeah, thank you. Silvia's book, you almost know, or Caliban and the Witch, describes among, well, the issue of the commons and its relationship to the destruction of the female body in European history is, and the terrorization is fundamental to to the divisions among human beings now. That terror. It has to do with, in the history of the commons, the gender relations were, at least in Northwestern Europe, were very different. So that's been exciting. I heard exciting as a subject of study, as a subject of research. I'm speaking as a historian, to find out how deep this commons is, what a huge groundswell we have behind us. This is not an invented idea of cuteness, but this is a very powerful, and here I think all of us have some idea of it, and including David Graeber, who I was after earlier. I've been feeling a little bad about that, so I want to say a good thing there. Coming up earlier today was the issue of bread and butter issues came up. And I was very glad to hear that in the context. It was a theoretical context. And I suddenly thought, yes, for millennia, people fought for gleaning. A gleaning that enables a family to have bread, to go into the harvest after the private proprietors have reaped the field. Remember in Deuteronomy, speaking of the Old Testament, it says, don't clean up the field too well, he's saying to the Jewish landlords. Make sure you leave enough for the orphans, the foreigners, and the widows. Okay, so it's an anti-efficiency doctrine, this gleaning. Then bread and butter. What's butter? Well, you need to have a place to put your cow. And so these are two central aspects of the European commons, right into the 20th century. you know, it was a good insight that came from the conference. Bread and butter issues, you know, itself goes back, doesn't it, Ian? Okay. No, we'll have a moment of silence.
Yeah, Carmen, yeah. Good. You saw the movie, right?
So-
The Leaders?
Agnes Barlow, The Cleaners and I, strongly recommended. And she's made a documentary about it, that's also interesting, years later. We found in our researches into the West of Eden, which was organised in a crude heuristic of commoning in the city and in the country. And by the way, just a kind of, again, a crude slogan would be that the common in the view of some of us can be thought of as it were, anti-commodity. Okay? And in a way that's the challenge to anarchism, which historically has been so obsessed with the state that you find these arch-capitalists call themselves, you know, anarchists, libertarians. And that's because if you don't take the property question into account, then you're just left with the question of the state. I don't want to talk, we can talk later about the bad faith of that, the idea that of the Ayn Randian utopia. But we found when we talked to the communards of Albion Ridge that they would go over at the weekends into the Central Valley and go. They didn't even use the word then. Some of them now know it was gleaning. They reinvented gleaning. This was a practice that had been forgotten. So just as our philosopher friends, I mean, I don't put myself outside this, those of us who trained in philosophy, endless seminars on epistemology. How do I know this is a hand? You know, what is it to know anything? These are important questions. But Robert Proctor and I formulated a different question in our researches into big tobacco when Robert found the smoking, as it were, internal memo from Brown and Williamson. And by the way, Sasha, has it gone out yet? Watch out against the grain for Robert's magnum opus called A Golden Holocaust. But found the internal memo which said, doubt is our product. Here's an enlightenment project, people in white coats producing doubt, okay? I mean, he found that, I think, in the late 70s. Less surprising now that we have junk climate science. Gibson's law, for every PhD, there's an equal opposite PhD. Smokescreen. Science has smokescreen. So we had to invent a new discipline, a kind of counter-enlightenment discipline, agnotology. As a recovering classicist, I had to come up with these coinages. The science of ignorance. Ignorance has contours. Why have we forgotten Estovers? Why did Peter have to say the widow's Estovers? That's what he has helped to recover for us, the small charter of the forest. This is crucial work because we're going to have to rediscover it. Not just listen to our elders, all the women who are still outside the cash nexus, listening about living on $1 a day. Well, you know damn well that's because there's still at least some access, use rights, to the bounty of nature in the kind of Winstanley way. Okay? And so May Day is going to be consciously, we're a lighthouse and a lifeboat for threatened archives, but there are some things which we need to gather positively, and we want to do that for the struggle against GMOs, genetic engineering, right? A very interesting social movement. The first time in social history that a nation-state was forced to stage a public debate before a technology was introduced. Of course, they were Potemkin debates. It got a bit out of hand. I went on a tour with Ignacio Chapella, who's writing, almost completing now, the second retort pamphlet after Ned Ludd and Queen Mab, Liberation Biology. And it was a problem, right? Because a lot of people in that movement, and this is where we have an interesting set of questions about the kinds of collectivities produced unexpectedly by new technical developments. That movement combined feminist witches, Prince Charles, country vicars, the Countryside Association, Tory gentlemen. They didn't like the Frankenfoods, that was the slogan. So from a communist perspective, what was at least as important, and this is what Monsanto was interested in, was making, I mean, the transfection of these seeds is essentially a proprietary claim. They're firing a gene gun into the nucleus so they can barcode the seed. They want to send the farmers of the world to the market. The scandal of the gift of the seed. It's a common, right? The commons have an outside, but the community that shares the seed since time out of mind, and most of the farmers of the earth are still doing that. They can't afford to get into the cash nexus. If they do, they often go deep into debt. Raj Patel has recorded the number of suicides in India. Farmers by the thousands are killing themselves by the very poisons that they're going into debt to buy to put on Monsanto seeds. So we need a political economy of the seed, all right? It's an enclosure of the seed to bring you back to market. Because the seed is a gender-based object. It's both means of production for the next harvest and its product, which you crush and produce bread, the staff of line. So we need a communist perspective for GMOs, and we need a communist perspective for the struggle in the streets. 100 years ago it was London and San Francisco and New York. Right now it's in Delhi and all the cities of Asia. The clearing of the street life, the clearing of animals, of street vendors, of cyclists, of tricyclists for the circulation, as Guy Deport said, a city for idiots, the demands of capital. And they can't stand it. They can't even stand it when faced with a slogan which says, we're not blocking traffic, we are traffic, right? I don't put myself outside this. I'll be home soon, darling. I'm caught in traffic. No, I'm not. I am traffic, right? So we need to understand.
Right, so let's now open this up. Someone in the back, yes? That's you.
Yeah, my voice is loud, so I don't know if you want me to use the mic. I wasn't going to bring up this topic. I didn't know that this was the right place. But since you brought up the internet and also Monsanto, I would like to make a few comments, if it's okay. I'm at a loss as an individual because I'm very concerned about the digital world. I don't own a cell phone. I think they cause brain cancer. I also think that they're giving cancer to me, sitting next to someone with these devices. The people that have come out talking about this, their jobs, they're being fired or, they're disappearing. One of the researchers that made headline news, University of Pittsburgh, is not in that position anymore. Try to get a hold of him. His research said, do not give the cell phone to anyone below the age of 12. If you use it very seldomly, and try to stay away from someone who does use it. The research, of course, is inconclusive, okay? But the New York Times had an article saying it's inconclusive, but what was very telling about that article is that the companies that make these devices have done the testing, and they are not releasing the testing, and nobody's asking them to release the testing. I don't know what the wireless is doing to us. Now, that's one health issue. Then there's the issue of surveillance, which, I believe you were talking about. The other day I was on campus, a woman talked about Facebook and all the information being logged on Facebook is just being given to companies. And And then the guy from Google was here 2 hours later, and unfortunately I couldn't get into the main hall. And when I tried to get into the main hall after the talk was over, they wouldn't let people in because I wanted to ask a question or make a comment, for that matter. What's coming down the pike is very scary to me. Okay, they are watching everything. Our privacy is gone. The guy from Google talked about automobiles that don't have drivers, and he said, you know what? Don't worry about the texting anymore and the cell phone use, which is an issue that concerns me. I'm from New York City. I moved to Ithaca 30 years ago. I'm afraid of driving. I don't drive. So I'm on a bike every day, and I see everybody texting and on their cell phone, and the windows are getting more darker and darker. You can't see the driver, which is a very important communication aspect in daily life. So I've written about this. I've been to meetings. I went before the city's bicycle committee. Nobody cares. The activists don't care because they're busy communicating to other activists.
Okay,
So I needed to say that so you can understand my question. I wasn't going to talk about this. I came as just someone wanting to know more about anarchism. I'm not an anarchist. I'm not a communist. I'm not a socialist. I lean towards socialism. But I'm a human being who has lived for 30 years of my adult life trying to make the world a better place. And I see humanity, not making the right choices. People that I would think, the community that I would think would ask the hard questions. So, I would like to ask you, what do you think about this?
Okay.
Because I live in a community where this is not a dialogue, and I would like to also see, for those who work for Cornell, because Monsanto gives a lot of money to Cornell, by the way. Google, Scorton, when he introduced the Google guy, $38 billion. And I think that was a year. Okay, so I'm not trying to point the finger because I also go online, but I'm just raising the issue of where this is taking us because they are going to implant this in our brain in the near future, and they're not telling you that.
So, Ian, as a historian of technics, what's a communist take on technology?
Well, very briefly, thank you. I feel the passion there, right? And we don't know enough about it. And dig where you stand. Encourage people to make the kind of research. What does a historian of techniques think? Well, compared to what I suppose I hear your pain. 1 billion people will die from smoking cigarettes this century. It's a completely predictable 7 minutes a cigarette. There's a big thing. The slaughter on the roads of automobiles is a huge thing. These are entirely preventable, and we know the correlation. The correlations you're talking about are complex, highly mediated. Work needs to be done. I think that's what it is.
Other questions? Yes.
I believe, I forget who it was, brought up the concept of mutual aid in Kropotkin. I was wondering if perhaps that could be elucidated a little more for lay people who like this stuff.
So more on Kropotkin and mutual aid.
Yeah, Kropotkin just said to Darwin essentially, or the Huxley as Darwin Bulldog, for every example of competition, I can give you one of cooperation. He didn't deny that there was competition in the world. His point really was that Darwin was really a Malthusian. Darwin was living through the enclosures. His co-discoverer, Wallace, who wrote more or less in the very same vocabulary from the other side of the world, was one of the most famous doublets in the history of science. And Darwin was frozen for 2 weeks when he was hesitating to publish The Origin of the Species. And he said, mobilize the powerful. He was powerful, he married his cousin with Wedgwood. He came from a rich family. It allowed him to do his wonderful work. And Wallace, as a young man, was measuring out the enclosure, the fields for enclosure. So these were two men who were projecting the world of enclosure and dispossession onto nature. Kropotkin came from a different place, and so I guess what I'm saying is that an anarchist epistemology should listen to the great, now more or less forgotten philosopher of science, the kind of the anti-Kuhn in a way, or the Kuhn who pushed Kuhn to the limit, namely Paul Feyerabend, one of whose students was Eddie Ewan's father, who dropped the induction problem to document the social revolution in the Bay Area. And he spent the rest of his life doing that, and it's the greatest archive of social movement anywhere on earth, and it's so vast that no one can even catalogue it. The University of California has it, and it's a scandal. We hope that it will be. This is the history we need to recover. There's much more to say. I look forward to speaking to you on Kropotkin. Thank you.
Any other questions? Interventions?
Can I add a small point just very quickly to that? Just to connect it up to the theme of the conference as well, in part, which is that Kropotkin actually learned a lot from a Japanese biologist at the time. And so he traveled and spent time in Siberia and compared and contrasted the context of Siberia with the tropical environments that Darwin was spending time in. But I think it's also important to recognize Kropotkin was learning from people in other places as well, some places that were considered peripheral in some sense, right, in the context at that time. And so there are these interesting lineages that get followed in certain ways that pop up. And so Kropotkin's got a very interesting kind of itinerary in all of this as well. I think it's a small point.
Pass the microphone to the far.
It's all right, I know where you're going. So this has been a fascinating couple of days, and I thank you all for being part of making this happen, and especially for those of you who are bearing the weight of wrapping things up for us. In the beginning of several of the things that you said, particularly Silvia, you're talking about recognizing the structure of this conference as part of a way we can intervene in both academic and perhaps anarchist praxis. The structure of the conference as the way we can intervene in activist, anarchist, academic, all these days, praxis. And I'm wondering if you can reflect, all three of you, or anyone else for that matter, on what sorts of tools from direct activism, from consensus building, from anarchist activism in general, or things informed by that, might be useful for us in an academic context where we're trying to build more consensus-based, egalitarian, non-hierarchical forms of communication.
Well, I'm part of it. I think, first of all, that the importance of organizing, even though we think that much of the building of commons of knowledge at this point occurs outside of the academic world. But nevertheless, the academic world, I believe, is a very, very important point of struggle, and we cannot abandon it, on the contrary. And I think that the importance of organizing there in a collective way is crucial. There is now, an organization, international organization called the HU Factory Collective. I don't know if you're aware of, who has basically begun to establish a network, an international network of people who are engaged in an exchange of their experiences, struggles, information about the type of transformation that are taking place in the universities. And HU Factory, the term, right, reveals the theory behind it, which I'm not completely in agreement with, on the contrary, I have a lot of criticism, but it's the idea that today the university and the places of knowledge production have an importance that is similar to that of the factory in the past. Right? So there's a few problems with that theory, at least in my view, but I believe that that network has been extremely important in putting people in touch with each other and exchanging information and also creating moments of struggle and circulating the experiences of people that have had in the university about how to come together, what kind of battles, what kind of tactics that you use. Fighting, for example, against the whole issue of grading, creating forms of, in the university, creating forms of production of knowledge that, in a sense, are an alternative to the production of knowledge that is commercialized. Also the struggle around that. And also, and very important, breaking down those divisions that exist in academia as to who is a legitimate producer of knowledge or not. For example, the fact that there is a whole population of workers that are excluded, are made invisible, right? That the non-academic staff, that in fact in many cases has more knowledge than many of us. When for example, I was teaching at Ulster University, and I looked at the people who were serving in the cafeteria, who were cleaning the floor and so forth. Many of them had a tremendous amount of knowledge. They were coming from Guatemala, they were coming from Mexico, they were coming from places, many were coming from struggles that were very important, to the students if they've known about. But they are not seen as people. I think these are the kind of struggle we need to engage in. That if we want to be successful in challenging, the kind of commercialization of knowledge that is happening now, what is happening to the academic world, which everybody knows, I cannot talk about it. I think we also need to begin with that kind of struggle. We need to begin to refuse the way in which production of knowledge is being defined. It was a legitimate subject.
Yeah, one of the most important slogans of '68, forgive, I'll try a little parlez-vous here, was, parlez à vos voisins. That was a revolutionary slogan, to speak to your neighbors. And this is what, in a way, what came to mind listening to Silvia. I come from a university that has a library with 5 stories. They've taken all the books from 4 of them just in the last 2 years. Many have been shredded. Books have been shredded. It's like, what Bloomberg and the sanitation trucks did to the great library at Zuccotti Park.
5,000 is shredded.
My department of history had 23 people in it. Now it has 4 tenured people. We're part of the business university. What you have here is a from my perspective, I would travel to come to listen to you. This is a deep, important occasion. The knowledge that we are exchanging is rare and precious. From Tahrir Square, from Peru, from Buenos Aires, from Mexico City, from Oaxaca, from Chiapas, from Ithaca, from Manhattan. This knowledge that we have been exchanging is from London, sorry, from Chicago, Penelope. No, this is a beautiful, beautiful experience. So we have to fight for it. And these assemblies, we must create more assemblies and more exchanges, because people like myself are willing to learn and take spirit. Oh, did our hearts rise last year? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
That was something. In full flow. Thank you for the questions. And yes, look to how to sort out the week from the chat. There are good teachers here. Ask Shelley and Barry and Natalie and those who will be good mentors. In a culture dedicated to positivity, remember that, okay, negation is good. 1,000 no's we heard from Tahrir Square. In the Guardian Notes and Queries a few weeks ago, somebody wrote in, it's kind of a quote from Notes and Queries, that was an old Victorian enterprise. Was saying, is it true that the dark satanic mills were not the factories, but the churches, because he was anti-clerical. He was an antinomian. Antinomian, by the way, is a kind of end run around the fake oppositions. Those who were opposed to the laws of God and man, of Moses and man, say William Blake, for the 17th century. And somebody wrote in and said, of course, it was the Albion Mill on the South Bank, near what is now the National Theatre, and the New Globe, and the refunctioning power station to take off those who lived in London. And that had a new engine in it, and it terrified the millers on the South Bank of what we call now in the business school here a disruptive technology. The Luddites were out. Again, remember that the left and the right told the same lie about the Luddites, that they were somehow against technology. What crap. Rebels against the future. That was the title of somebody who was supposedly writing in favour of the Luddites, Kirkpatrick said. They weren't against the future, they were against the foreclosure of the future. And Peter's beautiful meditation, generalizing Lud as a moment of resistance in which, believe it or not, the weavers were in the vanguard of a global movement against mechanization, of the kind that was happening at the Albion Mill. It burned down. What year, Peter, was we talking about? 1792. Okay, 1792, the Albion Mill burns down. And probably Blake did have, in writing Jerusalem, did have in mind the Albion Mill. He also had in mind the churches, of course, and the priests. Somebody wrote in, another person wrote in, just a two-liner, it was great. He said, I think, is it true? They suggested it was. That actually, Jerusalem, which is a series of 4 questions that Blake raises, and did those feet, and was the countenance divine? Actually, the answer to those was no, 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 and get them yourself. That's what Jerusalem was about. So I just want to speak up for negativity, anarchism, the chaos of negativity. And enough of these slurs about anarchists not being able to organise the ground people down. Right? Promise.
Okay, I think we should move to wrap up. If there's a
I just want to say something quick. In response to that question, it sounds antiquarian, maybe a little trivial, but since there are a lot of young people in the room and we didn't hear enough from them, I just want to make the point of, in history, aside from commodifying and trivializing everything, what the system has really done, aside from mass murder and other worse things, is erase history, erase memory, dispossess people of everything. So working to rebuild our collective memory and to learn to listen to other people's memories is a big part of cultivating the future. I just want people to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I want to start with, but I just want to add something to what is, I suppose, among the many struggles. I think that there are many, many fronts of struggle and many tactics and so forth. But certainly one thing that I think also goes back to the student movement of the 60s, it's also in every place to begin to look at what is the involvement of your institution into the war machines, into the, in particular the war machine. Today in the United States, so much of what is taking place in the university is financed by the military. And that's something that has to be dealt with. I mean, it's very, very important to find out
let's take a last question.
I think he asked first, actually. I'm sorry.
So my question is, last semester I was in Denmark, and there's a really nice museum near Copenhagen called Louisiana. It's full of surrealist and constructivist art, but to get in there, at least as a student, you had to pay $30 US. And to me, going in there, I pay the money, like extortion. Then it just sort of makes me curious, moving on from that. At least for me, like art is for everyone. And so I guess my question is more towards Ian and your work with, is it Mayday Rooms?
Mayday Rooms.
Mayday Rooms. What will be the status of the works that you accumulate there?
Thank you. Yes. 20, 30 pounds, we haven't decided yet what the end. No, sliding scale. Sliding scale. Thank you. Well, first, the Hero Museum, I mean, this was a great surrealist, anarchist, friend of the SI. I want to commend the new anthology by Jakob Jakobsen and Miguel Bolt Rasmussen on decentering the situationists. We have work to do at Mayday on that. Talking to Donald Nicholson Smith last weekend in London. I don't blame the young scholars for talking about the English section of the SI. There was no English section, right? Donald and Tim Clark were expelled, and others at the same time. They spent 95% of their time in France. So we need praxis for one thing. The moment of reflection, use the academy to do that. That would be guaranteed when we go out. What are we going to be collecting? We're going to be inundated. Yes, it's a very good question. We want your help to try to understand how we can't let everybody in. We want these archives to be living archives. In a sense, the anti-model for us is the Tate, or the Whitechapel, or MoMA, or even perhaps here, bent on spectacular accumulation. The librarians at Stanford, my compañera used to be in charge of the rare books and manuscripts from 11 billion at the University of California, and her counterpart at Stanford was telling us that the managers now at Stanford are saying to the librarians, how does this library distinguish itself from other libraries? Well, it doesn't. The whole idea of a library is you can get a copy of what you want. All look the same, right? So we've got to brand ourselves. So fan out into Silicon Valley, looking for rich men and ask them if they would give their archives, and a lot of money, to the libraries. There is a crisis of knowledge in that sense. And don't believe that what the salesman of the virtual tell you. Bruce McHale, some of you might know the Internet Archive. Has anyone here used the Internet Archive? It's worth looking at. He's a libertarian who sold some software to Amazon. He invented the Wayback Machine, which allows time death to a search engine. And Bruce McHale thought that the best thing to do is to digitize everything. Just put it up there. He's completely reversed himself. He's now persuaded that the virtual world, the virtual life, is a brief interregnum between them. Because it ain't going to last. People in this world know that the migration problem is very, very unstable. We are certainly bent on a lot of digitization of making things available. And we are taking delivery probably of a scribe machine from Internet Archive with sophisticated software to make things available to you all in an unenclosed way, not like Google. So we have these kind of anti-models that we're working with at Mayday, but we're in very early stages, and the plan is that we will talk. We want to talk together to try to figure out how we're going to deal with this. But above all, we're a social space. And I think Silvia's completely right, and the speak to each other. That's the challenge of Occupy and the squares. It's a certain kind of body politics, right? It's not a self-selected community of friendsters, dematerialized. So, yes, it's all to be done, and I do apologize we didn't have more chance. I wanted to throw a bit more on the list of the collections that have started. The 2-minute clip of the great Moderator, Lee Smith doing his jazz. It's all broken down, but I'll give you the URL afterwards.
Okay, I think because of the demands of the body, it's time for us to wrap up. I want to thank all of you for coming to this panel and the organizers for this amazing conference. They've done an incredible job. And I should say that the books of Peter, Silvia, and Ian are all available on the tables outside, and Silvia will be speaking to them on Wednesday, but those books at 6 p.m. on Great Church tomorrow, same place at 3 o'clock, I think. So, thanks again.